And Goodman is basically the guy that launches ontology of art in analytic philosophy. So he may not be a metaphysician ontologist, but what he does have has metaphysical ontological consequences. So, for instance, when you say Goodman in this literature is seen as the nominalist position in the ontology of artworks, for instance, and nominalism is kind of a ontological position in a certain sense. That, of course, it is a position about the role of concepts and language, but nevertheless, it has consequences in terms of ontological commitment. Are we committed, for instance, committed to abstract entities? We are not. So this is a problem of nominalism. Yeah, you're right, Matthew. Yeah. So yeah, I think this is a very interesting question. This is why I jumped into your question, because I think this is very interesting. This attempt to evade metaphysics that ends up, in a sense, producing another kind of metaphysics because of ontological commitments, or as we've been calling here, orientations of thought that take as existent such sets of things instead of other sets of things, right? So it seems to be unavoidable. It may be unavoidable. This is an open question. My strategy was to transfer problems from the ontology to the theory of action. And my theory of action had to do with normativity, with Wittgenstein, Sellers, this constellation, Brandom, and all that. And in the end, you ended up with a kind of dependent set of entities that are dependent upon actions made by, things with brains like humans and stuff like that. So, of course, not an ontology in the sense of not fixing definite conditions of identification for artworks. This is, I think, good, even though Arthur Danto seems to try to compatibilize openness of the concept of art with a kind of essentialism, but this is also, we would have to take a very big detour in order to treat that problem. Adequate representation or not? Like, is it a system of categories that is impinging upon your mind or not? Like coming from the objective pole. So I think here we have basically we are being misled by a word, just the word given. Like, the fact is that forms of life are the fact is there's no really fact of the matter, but anyway, Wittgenstein has this problematic appeal to forms of life because he wants to make us stop philosophizing. So there you have like a kind of a dimension of the given, because you ought to be satisfied with the description of the up and running games of language that we are playing. But he also upholds the fact that those language games are always changing. So then the forms of life are always changing as well. So in any one given moment, you don't have the self-similarity between one moment and the next within the trajectory of a form of life in that sense. So I disagree that my answer would be no, that form of life is not an instance of it given in the problematic sense, in the sense of Sellers. The Sellers is mobilizing because it is not a metaphysically granted access to the real, not at all. It is actually a mediation. The form of life itself is a mediation. So, and what I think is interesting, I agree that Goodman has more to do with Carnap in a certain sense. But what I think is interesting in the Wittgensteinian picture is that forms of life are not only sayings or conceptualizings. The epistemological way of approaching is not the only one. Forms of life are doings. So this is why I'm very interested in forms of life and in the Brandomian also reconstruction or use of language as practical abilities. So he's not oriented from the point of view of a predicate. He's oriented from the point of view of the possible answers that any predicate might have in the domain of reference. Is that clear in a sense? So this is why, you know, a world different from a situation in ontology, which is only composed by multiples of multiples, but a world is characterized by a certain comparative consistency between its components. They get captured within a lattice, an ultra complex and multi-layered lattice. For any predicate you can come up with, that is constrained by the axiom of separation, as I was saying, like considering that there is already a domain, and any predicate you might come up with will give you a subset of that domain, which it will not generate the domain, because if you uphold that it will generate the domain, you will end up coming up with paradoxes in the Russellian sense. So you have this domain of things, multiples, and any predicate you can come up with will be captured within this differential web that is formalized with the Hightink algebra, that is composed by degrees of transcendental with a minimum and a maximum, and some operations you can conjoin degrees of existence, transcendental degrees, and make an envelope of different regions of the world. There are several different operations you can perform with that. So an object for him will be something that has a multiple as a counterpart. This is what he calls a postulate of materialism. If you read the text, he says, oh, I have the postulate of materialism, because this in itself can be an ontology. You can just, okay, I have an ontology that is based on category theory, that is unconstrained. It's just predicates and comparative relationships between the predicates, and you can come up with something with that. But he adds this postulate of materialism that any phenomenon will have a counterpart as a multiple as counterpart. So this is kind of the connection between ontology and the passage between ontology and the appearance of the multiple.